Hello and welcome, Macarja. Fáilte Arash go Undercover Irish. I'm really excited about this particular episode. It's been in my mind now for a long time to do this particular one, and this is the week that we get to do it. So I'm really looking forward to trying to tell this story as best as I can because it's a story that relates to my own home city, but it's a story that relates in a way to the rest of the world as well. So, Carja, Eraigling. Because every single street has a story. Every name, it's a choice. In Ireland and so many places that are shaped by empire, colonialism, occupation, these choices were never neutral. The naming of streets, monuments, public spaces, it's about power. It leaves its fingerprint. It's a name to claim, but to rename can be to resist. Now, Corja, let's start out in the modern day. In the north of Ireland right now, there is a controversy ongoing because Gaeilge Irish is being returned or restored to the public, I would say, by being added to street signs. Now, in many places, unfortunately, this is causing unrest and it's causing a kickback, which I think highlights probably the regressive and superiorist notion that was the Northern Statelet in the first place, the supremacist element of it. But there's a deep irony in it because many of these names are anglicised from Gaeilge in the first place. Belfast is a good example. Béal Feiriste is the original name. So while this story that we're going to tell today on the podcast takes us back in time, it's important from the outset to realise that issues like this are still very, very much alive, not just here in Ireland, but throughout the world as well. What does it mean to live among the empires? What does it mean to live in an occupation? To begin with, Corja, I want you, wherever you are in the world, to think about the street names or the place names outside of your house, outside of your place of work, the street names that you drive to or walk to or cycle to on your way to work or whatever you might be doing. Earlier on in the podcast, we focused on place names in Ireland, and we were largely focused on places that were almost God-given to us, that were named by nature, if you like, and we only had to understand the Gaeilge to understand the meaning of it. And of course, you can look back on that or listen back to that if you haven't already. But today we're looking more maybe urban, village, town. So places that were built up and then were named accordingly. Now consider the power that's bestowed within that gift of naming a street or a public place or wherever it might be. Naming and renaming is about controlling space and memory and identity. It's an expression of power. So often you'll have, particularly in places where you had an occupation or an imperial force or a colonization, you'll have a friction afterwards between decolonization and continuity. The continuity, of course, will be exposed by those who probably were part and parcel of the occupation or the imperial experience in the first place, whereas obviously the decolonization will be driven by those who want to remove the colonization or the power of the colonization. You know, much of empire still survives today in maps and signage and rituals, even after political independence is achieved in a country. You know, you've got symbolism versus substance. Do street names change lived realities, or are they symbolic? Are they stories? You've got language in politics. So I mentioned earlier on there about Gaeilge causing an uproar in the north of Ireland simply by returning to what I would say is its natural fixture, describing the land around it. Then you've got historical tensions. So in Ireland, and we're going to be coming to my own city of Cork, Cathair. In Ireland, you've had two dominant traditions. One, nationalistic, republican, which seeks independence for the country. And of course, there's a lot of shades within that. And the other, unionist. Again, a couple of different shades of orange, if you like, through that. But essentially, those are the two dominant political narratives that have been around for hundreds of years. And then you've also got issues around bureaucracy versus democracy. So you've got, and this will come up in our story today, you've got administrative orders, city managers and the bureaucrats, if you like, versus the councillors or the elected representatives of the people. You've got class and class power. You've got merchants involved. There's law, legitimacy and protest all tied up in this story that we're going to visit. So, Corja, even though I'm extremely proud to tell the story as somebody from Cahercarkey, we don't want to lose sight throughout this story that while this is a local dispute based on a national dispute, these topics and themes are international to their core. They pop up around the world in the past, the present, and they'll pop up again in the future. So, Corja, wherever you are in the world, welcome to my home city of Cork. Because for the next few moments, I'm going to paint the picture of Cork, Cahercarkey, the city of Cork, as it is now. Let's start with Cork, for example. Cork is simply an anglicisation of Corkig meaning marsh. So effectively, the English name doesn't actually mean anything at all. But that aside, let's come down to the city. If you look at some of the streets in the streetscape, the bridges and all that, sometimes the place names or the street names, they rhyme, if you get me. They make sense. So, for example, if you're driving down Brian Boru Street, you then cross the Brian Boru Bridge and you end up on Clontarf Street. So, think about that. Brian Boru, one of the last High Kings of Ireland, he's got a street named after him, he's got a bridge named after him, and then the next street that you arrive at is Clontarf Street. Brian Boru's most famous victory was at the Battle of Clontarf, where he defeated the Viking power in around the Pale, or in around Dublin at the time. So that makes sense. But sometimes it's not as easy. So, for example, if you go to the centre of Cork City of Cahercarkey is where most of the trade is, where most of the merchants are, where most of the shopping streets are. The centre of Cork is an island. There's a north channel of the River Lee and there's a south channel of the River Lee. And if you go to the furthest point, which is also the shortest part of the island, so just where the two channels of the river meet again, you'll find two bridges, one spanning the North Channel, one spanning the South Channel, and one is called Michael Collins Bridge, and one is called Eamon de Valera Bridge. So while the previous example, as I said, rhymed, it made sense, this one is a little bit more difficult to understand. For people who might not know, both men would be regarded as patriots, in the sense that they fought for Irish freedom, but both took a very, very different view on the treaty with Britain, which partitioned the country and suppressed the Republic of 1916. Michael Collins led the Free State, who were pro-treaty and in favour of the arrangement with Britain, whereas De Valera would have been seen as the political figurehead of the anti-treaty movement. So there's a little bit of irony that the two bridges pretty much flow into each other. There's only about 100 metres between both bridges. But to complicate the story further, the street that leads De Valera Bridge to Michael Collins Bridge is called Albert Street. Now, the Albert that refers to, if you're not familiar, is Prince Albert, so from the British monarchy. And the quay directly across from it is also called Albert's Quay. Now, this is in reference to a visit to Cork that was made by the British Queen, Queen Victoria, obviously accompanied by her husband, Prince Albert, on that visit in 1849. So this quay and this street was named in Albert's honour, while Victoria had Cove, the Cove of Cork, renamed Queenstown for a period of time. Now it's worth reflecting on 1849. At this time, the British had declared what they termed the famine over, but yet Cork and her citizens would have been still struggling with widespread poverty and starvation, workhouses filled beyond the max, etc. And yet the establishment saw fit to name the street and the quay in Albert's honour. Now, the quay itself also has questions because the quay alongside of it in today's day is named after Terence MacSwiney, Treilach Mach Sivna, Terence MacSwiney Quay. And a little bit more on this later on. But Terence MacSwiney would be seen as a patriot, a Republican figure who gave his life for the freedom of Ireland. And the next quay alongside of it is Union Quay. Now, in my naivety when I was younger, I had assumed that this was in reference to the trade union movement or trade unionism, because right across from this quay is the headquarters of now SIP2, formerly the ITGWU, which was a workers' union formed and associated with Jim Larkin and James Connolly, the famous Republicans and famous socialists of the time. So you have a strange situation on that quay as well, where you have MacSwiney as a freedom fighter sandwiched between Prince Albert on one side and on a celebration of the Act of Union as it is. So Union Quay is a celebration of the Act of Union between Britain and Ireland, an act that solidified British control over Ireland politically. So sometimes, like I said, the street names around us can rhyme and make perfect sense from one street to the next, from one bridge to the next. And other times, right in front of us, if we open our eyes, we see conflict not just between empire and republic, not just between occupation and emancipation, but sometimes even within those strands there can be tensions and differences of opinion. Now, anybody familiar with the history of Ireland knows that during the Tan War, the War of Independence, Cork was extremely busy, shall we say. It was a massive theatre of conflict. And such were the aggressions against the people of Cork that British forces actually, in frustration and in retribution and retaliation, burned the city of Cork to the ground, the city centre. So it's unusual when you think about that to look around Caherkirky today, Cork City today, and to see that the street names are still in large part named after imperial figures. So you have Albert Quay, Albert Street, Anglesey Street, Hanover Street, Coburg Street, Wellington Terrace. All of these names carry with them the grandeur of empire, the occupation of empire. These streets were specifically named, as we said earlier on in the podcast, as a position of power, as a portrayal of power. And it can be an unusual thing to comprehend or to think that in today's Ireland and in today's Caherkirky, these street names somehow still survive. But this brings us to today's story, or the build-up to today's story, because it's not that efforts were not made to change these names, to rename them. It's that most of them failed. It's not that no street name was ever changed. And to begin our story proper, we're going all the way back to 1920. Now, to understand Cork in 1920, the War of Independence is ongoing, the Tan War against British occupation. Cork Corporation, as the City Council was then known, was the first corporation in Ireland, the first local government to back the breakaway republic. So when Republicans achieved their mandate in the 1918 general election, instead of going to Westminster, they set up their own parliament in Leinster House in Dublin and declared the All-Ireland Republic, the 1916 proclamation, to be the government of the day. So Cork is the first to take the lead. And the leader in Cork, the first Republican Lord Mayor, as it would be called in English, was a man called Thomas MacCurtain. Now, I know many people will be familiar with Thomas MacCurtain, but if you're not, here's a brief description. So, Thomas MacCurtain was an Irish volunteer leader and the first Sinn Féin Lord Mayor of Cork. Now, a quick kind of aside segue about the word Lord Mayor. Ascoilga, it's Ord Vera, High Mayor. Ord, High, Vera, Mayor. So that's the term that I tend to prefer over the Lord Mayor, which is, a title of imperialism. But nevertheless, this was a big confrontation with the British Empire. The first citizen of the city becoming the leader of the city, obviously, and openly being in favour of a separatist government within Ireland, as the British would see it. Now, Thomas MacCurtain was murdered in the early hours of the 20th of March in 1920. The men who carried out the murder were later identified as members of the RIC, the Royal Irish Constabulary, essentially Britain's police force in Ireland. But there was an attempt at the time to muddy the waters, so it was essentially a black op. It was attempted to blame in the cloud of war, the fog of war. It was attempted by the British and the press to put the blame on an internal Republican feud. But this event shocked to the core not just people who were sympathetic to the Republican cause, but it shocked the city, the county, Ireland, and international reaction to its core. The first citizen of a city being murdered by an occupying police force. The public reaction was massive. There was widespread outrage. It was one of the largest funerals ever seen in Cork. And this led us to our story today, or this is the beginning of our story today. Because the reaction of the corporation at the time was to meet as soon as possible. And there were three main things that the corporation did in the wake of MacCurtain's murder. Number one, they set up an inquest. Now, this inquest was really important because the coroner's jury returned a verdict of willful murder, stating that the attack was organised by the RIC, and it named the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George among those responsible. Now, this is an incredible act of courage and truth-telling in the midst of the fog of war. That inquest ruled on the 17th of April 1920. The second thing they did was they set up a public fund to honour MacCurtain. But the third thing was that a street in the city, which was named King Street, would be officially renamed MacCurtain Street in the honour of Thomas MacCurtain. Now, there are two little ironies in this. Number one, the death squad that murdered MacCurtain came from King Street Barracks. So they came from a barracks on that street. The second kind of irony, if you like, was that in the meeting of the corporation, there was only one objector to the renaming of this street. And part of the rationale was that it wasn't named King Street in honour of a king of Britain, it was named after a family. This was a man called Sir John Scott. He was a commercial public representative. In other words, he was involved in trade and commerce. So he was one of these people who would have made his money, or his family would have made their money from Cork's role in the British Empire. So he would be very much on the establishment side, or the prior establishment side. Now, it's interesting to note that he's a commercial public representative, because as we go to the main part of our story, this will foreshadow future disagreements. Nevertheless, he couldn't find a seconder for his objection to it. And just like that, the click of a fingers, King Street became MacCurtain Street. The only amendment to it, interestingly enough, was that Terence MacSweeney, who proposed the street name change, asked for it. He said that it was their duty to do honour to the immortal dead, but he did propose that the plaque for the thoroughfare be solely in the Irish language, solely Oscailg, and it'll share one of the original street signs for this street, so it'll be Shroud on Cartánig. So just like that, the stroke of a pen, one vote, it becomes Shroud on Cartánig, the street of the curtain. It would be the anglicisation of it. Now, later signs have Shroud Vic Cartán, MacCurtain, and I'll share that as well. But the man who proposed the change was also the man that stepped into the breach. So the Ard Vera, the Lord Mayor of the city, had been murdered. Now imagine the terror that the murder of McCurtain caused for not just the general population of Cathcirkey, of Cork City, but of legislators and of councillors who supported the Republic. And that was the goal of it. Now, into the breach stepped the man who had proposed the street name change. Into the breach stepped Trealach Maxivna, Terence McSweeney, who'll be familiar to many listeners. Now, this speech, the acceptance speech of Trealach Maxivna, in my opinion, ranks as one of the greatest speeches ever written down and ever heard in any hall. And I'll link it in the show notes. But just to look at the first paragraph of his speech, he says, quote, "This is not an occasion for many words, least of all a conventional exchange of compliments and thanks. The circumstances of the vacancy in the office of Lord Mayor governed inevitably the filling of it." And I come here more as a soldier stepping into the breach than as an administrator to fill the first post in the municipality. At a normal time, it would be your duty to find the post councillor most practical and experienced in public affairs. But the time is not normal. We see in the manner in which our late Lord Mayor was murdered an attempt to terrify us all. Our first duty is to answer that threat in the only fitting manner by showing ourselves unterrified, cool, and inflexible for the fulfillment of our chief purpose, the establishment of the independence and integrity of our country, the peace and the happiness of our country. To that end, I am here. End of quote. Like I said, I'll link the full speech into the show notes. It's well worth looking at. But it shows the bravery of that man. He knew what he was stepping into. And as people who know the story of Trealach Maxivna, within short order, he was arrested by the British occupation and sentenced for seditious documents, basically treason against the British Empire. And they sentenced him to Brixton Prison, where he embarked on that most famous of Irish tactics, a hunger strike to death. Stating at his court-martial, he said, quote, "I shall be free, alive or dead, within a month." And this was in August 1920. It did take longer than a month, but McSweeney too passed, this time through hunger strike. Again, the international reaction was huge. Locally, nationally, the mourning was incredible and a fitting tribute to Trealach Maxivna. But if the renaming of a street, a small, I guess, symbolic thing in honour of McCurtain, was straightforward, Shride on Cartánig, in McSweeney's case, it actually starts the next part of our story. Because even though the corporation in the early 20s named a new housing project, McSweeney Villas, in Terence McSweeney's honour, the bid to name a prominent street within Cork in honour of McSweeney would prove more testing and more challenging. Chief amongst those campaigning for a fitting tribute to Terence McSweeney, Trealach Maxivna, were his own family. And on numerous occasions, we can see this in the newspaper archives as they appeal, along with other organisations on the Republican side, for a fitting tribute to the martyr McSweeney. But now we have to understand the complex nature of Ireland's politics, particularly as we enter into the 1930s. Without going too much into it, and I'll try to generalise as much as possible, the Republican side, which was against the treaty, had now fractured into 2 or 3 or perhaps even 4. In the late 20s, basically, part of the Republicans or a portion of the Republicans decided to enter into politics, and they initially formed Fianna Fáil. You still had the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, the anti-treaty forces still existed as an organisation along with some splinter organisations, and you still had the original Sinn Féin party, which at this point still took the line of abstentionism. In other words, they did not recognise officially the government and the institutions of the state because they believed that this was a government that usurped 1916 and the first Dáil. On the other side of the conflict, you have what becomes Fine Gael. This is an amalgamation of centrist, the Centre Party, the Farmers' Party. They have an awful lot of moneyed interest. Maybe the people who previously had been either home rulers or in favour of the British establishment in Ireland prior to the War of Independence. And you also have a pretty large growing fascist group on the streets, in particular the Blue Shirts, which later pretty quickly become aligned with Fine Gael. Fine Gael also has close links with parties or groups which stand at local government, which represent traders and commercial interests. So there's this big mix of political forces in Ireland in the late 20s and the 30s. And on top of that, you have different narratives emerging. So the Free State groups, whether it's Fine Gael or the Blue Shirts or whatever, what you tend to see is a realization deep within them, perhaps, that the Republic of 1916 and certainly the 1919 Democratic Programme were not achieved or established. And so they're not just kind of pushing it to one side, but they're openly opposing that. They're embracing Ireland's role within the Commonwealth. They're standing for that section of politics. On the Republican side, you have pretty quickly a disillusionment in some quarters with the Fianna Fáil project, especially coming towards the late 30s. In the early 30s, they're all united because the prisoners, the IRA prisoners, have been released, but there are tensions now growing within that. That's a snapshot of what's going on. And one of the reasons why it is a thorny issue for some to deal with the changing of street names, particularly the renaming of colonial names, when to me it should have been straightforward. But the campaign to name a road or a street after McSweeney or in his honour was backed 100% by the Cork Corporation in the early 30s. They voted to rename Wellington Road, to Terence McSweeney Road. But in true bureaucratic fashion, this was never actioned by the powers that be within the corporation. The city manager, a man called Philip Monaghan, who will come to prominence later in the story again. But I do find it interesting that in 1940, for example, I see a letter to the editor of a newspaper of the Irish Press from Eilish McCurtain. And in the letter, which is very interesting in its contents, but a subject for a different day, and perhaps I'll share that letter on the Patreon. But Eilish names her address as Terence McSweeney Road, Cork, 5th of January 1940. So in the minds of certain people, these changes meant something and they held on to it despite lack of action from the corporation. But this dispute drags on over the 30s and it's building to a crescendo which we're going to see in this podcast. And to try to control the narrative or to try to suppress it or dampen it down, Cork Corporation takes a decision. And this is in the 40s. So think about this for a second. A world war is raging. The 26 counties of Ireland is neutral. And while war rages in Europe and around the world, there are other wars of words raging in Cork Corporation around this issue. And in that most, I suppose, bureaucratic and that most Irish bureaucratic ways of dealing with this, a subcommittee is set up. So in 1944, finally, Cork Corporation appoints a subcommittee to examine this. Now, the members of the subcommittee are the sitting Lord Mayor, the Ard Vera, A. Healy, T. Quill, J. M. Buckley, and their job is to consider the street names in the city. They are asked to report back to the main corporation. But if the goal of the corporation was to try to suppress this or to water it down, they got a very strong answer from the subcommittee. Because within the subcommittee was the Ard Vera, the Lord Mayor. And the political situation at the time, I'm guessing, led him to take a strong stance on it. Local elections were on the horizon. And the Lord Mayor of Cork at the time was Councillor Sean Cronin. He was attached to the Fianna Fáil party. But just like the 30s and into the 40s, he was looking over his shoulder at other Republican groups, and he was determined to take a strong line on this. And the committee reported back. They recommended the following changes. Anglesey Street, which would be next to the City Hall, today's City Hall, Anglesey Street would be renamed McSweeney Road. This would finally honour Terence McSweeney, Tréalach Machsivna. But they didn't stop there. Albert Quay, which I mentioned at the start of the podcast, would now become Casement Quay, named in honour of Roger Casement, who was hanged as a result of his involvement in 1916, or in the lead up to 1916. Wellington Road would now become Collins Road, named after Michael Collins. Now, I find this one particularly interesting because my reading of this is it's a way of trying to get those who would be on the Fine Gael side of politics to agree to these changes, because generally speaking, their support within Cork will come from an element which will be uncomfortable with this. The Grand Parade, Shroud on Capel Vui, would now become Connolly Street, named after James Connolly, the renowned socialist and Republican executed in 1916. Princess Street would now become Clark Street, named after Thomas J. Clark, again, 1916 hero. Marlborough Street would now become McDermott Street, named after Sean McDermott, who was executed again in the aftermath of 1916. Cook Street would become McDonough Street, named after Thomas McDonough. And Pembroke Street would now become Kent Street, named after Eamon Kent, again, 1916. Not stopping there, Winthrop Street would become Plunkett Avenue, named after Joseph Plunkett. Yeah, Joseph Mary Plunkett, he of the most beautiful ballad, Grace. George's Quay would now become O'Donovan Rossa Quay, named after the Cork Fenian, Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa. So now this subcommittee is even going back to previous rebellions against British rule. And probably most jarring of all for opponents of these changes, the South Mall would become Pearse Street, named after Padraig MacPherce, Padraig Pearse, also executed in 1916, the man who read the proclamation on the steps of the GPO. I say probably most jarring of all because while many of those streets would have been filled with traders and the type of people who, and again this is a generalization, but many people who would have been very comfortable under the British Empire and made their living, made their wealth from Cork's role in the British Empire, the South Mall in particular at the time would have been regarded as a street of money, a street of solicitors, a street of the old establishment order. And now the streets subcommittee was proposing that it be renamed Pearse Street. So these recommendations came before Cork City Corporation, as I said, in 1944. So just as on the continent, World War II was coming to a crescendo. And the council members in attendance, the majority of them were in favour of the changes. The only thing that was raised again, and we think back to the changing of King Street to McCurtain Street in the aftermath of McCurtain. The only objections put forward were the thoughts and the considerations of those people living on the streets. And it was proposed that plebiscites be carried out. But from my point of view, at least anyway, or my opinion, credit the Ard Vera at the time. He rejected this idea that a plebiscite be carried out. And he stated and wondered whether the people had been consulted when the original names were put forward. A fair point. Now, this comment, this was the clincher on the night, and the motion recommending the name changes was adopted. But this wasn't the end of the story, and this didn't result in the actioning of those name changes. As you can imagine, the plan to completely redraw or rename, to be more accurate, Cork's street names, the street names of Caherkirky, would lead to immediate uproar within certain sections of the community, and none more so than on the aforementioned South Mall. So, the Evening Echo of November the 24th, 1944, carries the following protest. Proposed changing of Cork street name. The Munster branch of the Irish Dental Association has adopted a resolution declaring that, quote, in view of the fact that the name South Mall cannot be regarded as having any political significance, the Council of the Munster branch of the Irish Dental Association feel it incumbent on them to protest against the change on behalf of the dental surgeons whose practices are situated in the street in question. It is felt that the change is absolutely unnecessary and would cause considerable inconvenience and loss. So we see immediately the movement of within the council bureaucrats and the city manager to stem this. And we see outside of it, that's just one example. The merchants, the moneyed interests within Cork City, in particular on the South Mall, opposing these changes. In the South Mall, they're kind of clever in their political approach to it. They're saying, well, the South Mall doesn't have a political connotation attached to it, whereas the other ones very much do. But again, the process goes on, the conflict goes on, and within a short space of time, it's back on the agenda. There's a lot of toing and froing. You can see it in the newspaper archives. Senior counsels and barristers are asked on their opinion on the legality of the changes. And within a short amount of time, the Lord Mayor is back, Ard Vera Churky is back, and he's digging in. He's pointing out at the next meeting that no other country except Ireland glorifies their despoilers, quote. And he refers to the fact that the present street names in Cork are named after the likes of the Duke of Wellington. He said Ireland was compelled to live with the names while she was unfree, and it was now time to undo that. He asked, and here's the kind of quote attributed to him, he asked, was it likely that the English would name streets after Hitler or Göring? So this is 1944 now, remember the political and the geopolitical situation. And he asked, would the English agree to call any street in London after Eamon de Valera? Now, outside of the corporation, so this guy, Lord Mayor Cronin, is looking over his shoulders at other Republican groups, and this is one of the reasons I believe he's taking such a strong stand. Outside of the corporation, these street name changes have strong support from the IRA, the old IRA Men's Association, from the GAA, the Gaelic Athletic Association, Common Luclas Gael, and Miss Etna Nixivna, the surviving sister of Terence McSweeney. She's also on the side of it. And as mentioned earlier, she's expressing her frustration that it's taken so long to decolonise Cork's streets. On the other side of the debate within the council, you have John Horgan, known as JJ Horgan. Now, it's worth mentioning about John Horgan because he has a fame in his own right. He was closely associated with the Irish Parliamentary Party, but also the Irish Volunteers. So he is a nationalist in name, but he's a solicitor, and he's also very close to the previous regime that existed in Cork, I suppose, prior to the revolutionary years. He's the son of a solicitor. He's educated in Clongowes. And if Cronin is looking over his shoulder at his electorate and his voters, J.J. Horgan is also looking over his shoulders to represent those that he feels will turn up for him in the next local election. And he cautions against these changes. Horgan's objection is on the legal basis. He cautions against the changes being proceeded to, and he wondered if legal action would be taken against the council or the corporation if they passed these changes. He warned about injunction, and he said that members who vote in favour of the proposal could be listed as special defendants liable for costs and proceedings, to which Mr. J.P. Healy, known as Klondike, responded, "We will go to jail, Lord Mayor." Again, the Lord Mayor also refuses to back down the Ard Vera. He says, "We took an action and we will carry it out." Time drags on, a plebiscite is announced, and its findings are due in June 1945. But this is not good enough for Ard Vera Sean Cronin, and it's not good enough for the pressure that's building on the council from outside groups who are keen to see the decolonisation of Caherkirky. And an amazing event happens. In defiance of the management of the council and in defiance of all legality, the Ard Vera presides over a private meeting in the City Hall of Cork, of the Cork Street Names Subcommittee. Now, there are representatives from Fianna Fáil, from the old IRA's Men's Association, from Conran na Gaeilge, from Sinn Féin, from the Labour Party, from the GAA and the Camogie Board, and even Altri na Hashiraha are at the meeting. The meeting decides that on Saturday, May the 5th, before the results of the plebiscite are known, those at the meeting and their supporters would take their own direct action to enforce the motion. And sure enough, on that day, all the groups mentioned and the Ard Vera lead a parade of members of the Corporation National Organisation in the city. Procession assembled opposite the Model School in Anglesey Street, or McSweeney Road as they wanted to rename it. They marched along Brian Boru Bridge, along McCurtain Street, down Patrick Street and onto the Grand Parade, Shroud on Coppel Vree. The first dedication took place at the National Monument, and it changed the name of the Grand Parade to Connolly Street, Shroud O'Caneela. Next up was Pierce Street, the one that caused most of the hassle, the South Mall. It was changed to Shroud Macfirish, the street of the Pierce on Fearshook. They then went on to name Clark Street, Shroud O'Cleric, McDermott Street, Shroud McDermida, McDonough Street, Shroud McDonagha, Kent Street, Shroud Kent, Plunkett Avenue, Oscail Plunkade. At each of the streets, orations were made. People honoured the memories of the men and women who'd taken part in the 1916 Rising. The new nameplates were painted in Irish in white on a green background with a yellow border superimposed on the existing metal nameplates. Now you can imagine the scene. Marching bands coming on, walking in procession, the old IRA walking in procession, all around the streets of their own city in order to decolonise the street names and to honour those who had fought for independence and for the vision that they believed in too. One of the quotes that the Ard Vera has attributed to him on this occasion is, he says, "We will not be said by Victorian laws, and we will not be satisfied until everything Victorian is wiped out in this city." Now, strong words, obviously, and something that links into the modern day and something that I'll be talking about in the exclusive Patreon episode linked to this particular podcast. And so the changes were enforced by a show of strength, by a mixture of groups and a large procession. But if the people who honoured the leaders of 1916 and others on that day thought that they had put a fitting tribute in place that would be permanent, they were very much mistaken. Because the bureaucracy, the city manager, Philip Monaghan, was extremely unhappy with this situation, as you can imagine. And within hours, he and the bureaucracy struck back. For the duration of the weekend, the street signs were left up. But on Monday morning, May the 7th, corporation workers were ordered to remove all of the new nameplates on his direct instructions. Within 5 weeks, the results of the plebiscite were announced. Now remember, the plebiscites were taken on the streets in question, which are largely made up of ratepayers, commercial businesses, and generally, and this is a generalization, but generally the wealthier people within society at the time. And the objections were Albert Quay, 46%, George's Quay, 54% objected, Winthrop Street, 54% objected, Princess Street, 56% objected, Grand Parade, Shroyd on Capel Vui, 74% objected, Cook Street, 75%, Pembroke Street, 79%, Marlborough Street, 81%, and in the home of finance and money on the South Mall, an 89% objection to the decolonisation of the names of the streets. So the city manager, Philip Monaghan, announces that as a result of these objections, no changes would be made. And he's quoting, in that case, legislation which is older than the Republican Corporation. It goes back to British times. It's interesting to contrast the difference between the attempt to change these street names and how easy and efficient it was for the Republican Corporation of 1920 to change the name of King Street to Shroyd on Carthonig, McCurtain Street. And the controversy in terms of its direct relation to the city centre streets after that seemed to peter out. The whole movement served a purpose, a political purpose, certainly for the Fianna Fáil Lord Mayor Ardmhéara, Sean Cronin, who was returned handsomely in the next local election. J.J. Horgan, too, was returned with interest in the next council. But there were notable acts of resistance to the quashing of the democratic attempt to decolonise the streets of Caher-Harkey. One of those that was involved in the attempts to change the names was Cumann Lúthchleas Gael Corky, in other words, the GAA, the Gaelic Athletic Association, the Cork County Board. Now, their headquarters was at Cook Street, number 36 Cook Street, right up until 1976. And on all of their stationery and all of their communications for years afterwards, in spite of the usurping of the democratic changes, the GAA used Shroyd, Vic Donncha, Herkig, Trucashay 36, Shroyd Street, Vic Donncha, Kirkig, Cork, as their address, right up until they moved to Páirc Uí Chaoimh in 1976. But this particular part of the story isn't done just yet. Because if those who were objecting to the street name changes were motivated by preventing the names of patriots and freedom fighters from gaining what we spoke about at the start of the podcast, that permanent public honour in the streetscape, in the public memory, well, they were on a Pyrrhic victory. In other words, a victory that would be short-lived. Because around about the time, in the late 40s, Cork Corporation, like many of the local authorities around Ireland at the time, and something which is linked to today in terms of the housing crisis we have right now, even in spite of the poor economic circumstances that they faced, they were able to build public housing. not just public housing, but quality public housing that would be made available to those in need of it in housing crisis at affordable rents. 2 kilometres south of Caherkirky, south of Cork City, is Ballyfehan, Ballyfehan, as we know it in English. It's one of the older suburbs of Cork. Now, this at the time was the biggest public housing project in Cork. And between 1948 and 1993, now that's a long period of time, but the majority of the construction was done in the late 40s and early 50s. About 1,316 dwellings across 11 housing schemes were built by the Cork Corporation. The earlier phase, 48 to 60, you're talking about over 1,000 houses. Now, the roads through Ballyfehan were named after the executed leaders of 1916. This tied the community into the national historic memory. So when you go through Ballyfehan, you will see the names of the patriots, the 7 who signed the proclamation, and others also honoured in that area. And in addition to the 7 signatories of the proclamation, there are other patriots honoured there, like Father Dominic Road. Close by, you have Joe Murphy Road, who is a link to the area historically, a former hunger striker. Now, Acharja, I think it's kind of nice that we come full circle to there. While the attempt to honour freedom fighters and revolutionaries within Caherkirky wasn't as straightforward as I would have liked to think, and while it ultimately ended in failure on the city island in the city centre, I think there's something very fitting almost and beautiful that when the patriots were honoured, that they were honoured in that way. The vision and the ideals of the 1916 proclamation, and particularly the 1919 democratic programme of the First Dáil, weren't simply about freeing the country and achieving independence. It was also a vision of what could be. And part of that was better societies and better housing for the people, better lives. Cork at the time, the majority of people would have lived in close to slum conditions in the city. And Ballyfehan and other suburbs, publicly built at the time in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s and the 70s, many of them served as models of what could happen when public money is invested in that thing that is so fundamental to all of us, a roof over our heads. Ballyfehan also, when you drive around it and have a look around it, was developed with the ideas of open space in mind, of fresh air, and of building real community. And mar uckle score show at this point, before I do a wrap up, on a personal level, a comment. In 1916, when we had the decade of centenaries, and particularly around 1916, the anniversary of the Easter Rising, I feel like, and I think many other people have commented on this as well, there was a kind of a contradiction within the government. There was a kind of they were kind of unsure as to how to go about remembering the physical sacrifice, the blood sacrifice of 1916 and of the Irish Republic, partially due to the continuing existence of partition. The island is still partitioned. Partially, I think, due to the fact that the promises of 16 and, as I said, 19, when you compare them, and this will be for another podcast, when you compare them to the Ireland that emerged in the South, nothing encapsulates that confusion better than the promotional video, and it was well flagged at the time, which included people like the British Queen Elizabeth and Bono and all of these people. But the video tasked with promoting the decade of centenaries around 1916 didn't include, the initial one at least, any of the 1916 leaders. So I think the establishment had a difficulty and a confusion around that commemoration. But bringing it back to Ballyfehan, a suburb named after the Patriots, in Ballyfehan there was a community group set up, and I'll put a link in the show notes to that particular group. And it was a community-wide effort in, taking in people of all politics and none, people from the pipe bands in Ballyphehane, from the GA in Ballyphehane, from the soccer clubs. It was an entire community effort, a genuine ground-up community effort. And they ran their own programme of events throughout the decade of centenaries. And many other communities and community organisations did similar. But the one in Ballyphehane certainly did a fitting tribute, in my view, to the memory of the patriots who sacrificed their lives, not just in 1916, but the likes of McCurtain that we mentioned in this podcast, the likes of McSweeney. And there's something that rhymes nicely there. There's something that sits really, really well, that the suburb that was finally named in honour of the patriots and their vision, when time came, fulfilled the kind of mandate of commemorating them in a fitting way and ensuring that future generations understand what the names on their street names really mean and really stand for. Agus sin é a cháirde. That's it for this episode. That's it for this part of the story in this episode. If you'd like to learn more about this topic, I'll be bringing it into the present day, updating people up to the present day over on Patreon in a kind of an accompaniment episode, because efforts like this to decolonise place names go on, but also there was a pretty audacious attempt to roll the clock back only recently in Caherkirky in Cork, and I'll be talking a little bit about that topic. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Corja. While it's, to me, a very local story, remember this is national too, because what happened in Cork broadly is something that happened elsewhere around Ireland as well. Every city and town has its own particular story around how it engaged with place names like these. And of course, O'Huig in the north, the fight for the status of An Gaeilge goes on. These are very live topics. Also, Corja, I want you to think of these as international as well. Wherever you're listening in Ireland or wherever you're listening in the globe, have a look around you. Ask yourself, who has the political power, who has named the streets that I walk on, who has named the streets that I live on, who has named the streets that I work on. It may reveal to you an interesting story. Feel free, Corja, to share the story with me. This is where the story becomes communal, if you like. If you've enjoyed this, Corja, and this has been a long episode, a long shift, one that I've really, really enjoyed. It's one I've been trying to put together for a long time, and I really, really enjoyed it. I'm really looking forward to pushing the publish button. If you've enjoyed it, Corja, number one, if you want to support me, this is an independent podcast. It's ad-free. So at present, any contribution I get really only goes towards paying for overheads and repaying the cost of microphone, etc., and things like that. If it's the case that you'd say, well, I'd love to give the price of a pint or the price of a cup of coffee to that particular person or whatever, if you met me, then Patreon is a fantastic way for you to do that. The money will go towards, as I said, paying the overheads of this podcast, which is a labour of love. It's something I've absolutely loved putting together. And it's somewhere that hopefully we can build a little bit of a community around this. My hope is to share one or two exclusive add-on episodes and also some visuals. Now, the visuals I have ready to go from previous episodes. So hopefully with every episode that goes out, there'll be visual accompaniments, which I'll put on Patreon. At present, for some reason, the app on my mobile isn't sharing what I wanted to do, but I can do it via the computer later on in the old-fashioned way, of course. My thanks again to you for being with me on this episode of Corja. A couple of things to mention. The story, the main body of the story around the attempt to change the street names, I first heard from Jim Lane. Jim Lane would be known to people in Cork, but Jim mentioned this story or told this story at a meeting of the Ballyphehane community group I referenced, which was put together to honour the Patriot dead in the lead up to the 2016 anniversary. So I wanted to mention that over a number of years, then I've enjoyed researching it myself, looking into the newspaper archives, finding old articles based on it, finding old letters to the editor. It would be impossible to include all of it, but just to mention that Second thing, Acharja, if you've enjoyed this episode, please do share it on your social media or share it with a friend. You've no idea. It makes the world of difference to the visibility of the podcast, which is growing and growing, thankfully. My thanks to you for doing that. I really, really appreciate it. But it just gives me and the podcast an opportunity to expand and to breathe in a kind of an environment where many of the producers are backed, we'll say, by ads, first of all, and second of all, by major production company. So if you can do that, if you've enjoyed this episode, please do. And the third thing Achardi would do to support the podcast is to leave a review. Wherever you listen to this podcast, please do leave a review, even a comment on social media, a comment on Spotify, or a comment here or a comment there. It would be, again, extremely appreciated by myself. So Acharja, Gorav Mila Mahagut, Asot Velum, thank you so much for your time on this podcast. I know it was considerably longer than other episodes, but I hope you enjoyed it every bit as much. I certainly enjoyed putting it together. I'm really looking forward to the next one. And hopefully, Acharja, you might listen to the accompanying podcast over on Patreon if you want to bring this story into the present day. So, Acharja Gilish, Gorav Mila Mahagut Arish, agus Slongafol Berigi Bua Eraigling.